The auction hammer fell at $475, and with it, the last thread of Sarah Bennett's old life snapped clean. She stood in the back of the county courthouse, her 8-year-old daughter Emma clutching her hand, and realized she had just bought an abandoned ranch with money that was supposed to cover next month's rent. The property photos had shown a weathered structure surrounded by 60 acres of high desert scrubland, 2 hours north of Albuquerque, with a notation that read, "Structural integrity unknown, buyer assumes all risk." Nobody else had bid. Nobody else had been desperate enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been a paralegal once, with a corner cubicle and health insurance and a husband who promised forever. That was before Michael left, before the medical bills from Emma's pneumonia buried them, before the law firm downsized and her position vanished like smoke. Now at 34, she was living in a weekly motel off Route 40, working double shifts at a truck stop diner and watching her daughter's childhood slip away in the fluorescent glow of cheap light bulbs and vending machine dinners. The ranch, crumbling and forgotten as it was, represented something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Possibility. The county clerk, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many desperate people, slid the paperwork across her desk. "Mrs. Bennett, I need to be clear about what you're buying here. The Rodriguez Ranch has been abandoned since 2003. The previous owner, Martin Rodriguez, died without heirs. The property sat in legal limbo for nearly 20 years. There's no water hookup, no electricity, and the last inspector who went out there said the main house was a liability waiting to happen." "I understand," Sarah said, signing her name with a pen that barely worked. Her handwriting, once neat and professional, now looked shaky. Emma leaned against her mother's side, too quiet for a child her age, drawing invisible patterns on the worn linoleum floor with the toe of her sneaker. The clerk's expression softened. "The land itself is decent, though. Good grazing territory back in the day. Rodriguez ran cattle there for 40 years before things went south. If you can make the house livable, you'll at least have a roof over your heads." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are easier places to start over, though. That ranch is isolated. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles out. Cell service is spotty at best." "Isolation sounds perfect right now," Sarah replied, taking the deed. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. They drove north that afternoon, Sarah's 15-year-old Civic loaded with everything they owned, which wasn't much. 3 suitcases of clothes, a box of Emma's books and drawings, Sarah's laptop that barely held a charge, and a canvas bag containing her grandmother's quilt, the only family heirloom that hadn't been sold. The highway stretched out before them, cutting through land that grew progressively more stark and beautiful as they left the city behind. Red rock formations rose from the earth like ancient sentinels, and the sky opened up in a way that made Sarah remember what hope used to feel like. Emma pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Mom, will we have animals, like horses or chickens?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Maybe someday, baby. First we need to fix up the house and make sure everything's safe." "Will I have my own room?" "I promise you'll have your own room. No more sharing a bed in a motel." Sarah reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to transfer a confidence she didn't quite feel. The turnoff came 20 miles past the last gas station, a narrow dirt road marked only by a faded wooden sign that read Rodriguez Ranch in letters barely visible beneath years of weathering. Sarah turned onto the road, and the Civic bounced over ruts and washouts that suggested nobody had maintained this access in a very long time. Dust billowed behind them, turning the afternoon sun into a hazy orange glow. Juniper trees twisted up from the rocky soil, their gnarled branches reaching toward the endless sky. When the ranch house finally came into view, Sarah's heart sank. The photos had been generous. The structure was a single-story adobe-style building with a collapsed section on the eastern side where the roof had given way. Windows were broken or missing entirely, dark openings that stared out like hollow eyes. The front porch sagged dangerously, its wooden posts leaning at angles that defied physics. Behind the house, she could see the skeletal remains of several outbuildings, a rusted water tank lying on its side, and miles of empty land stretching toward distant mesas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah parked the car and sat in silence for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. What had she done? This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a disaster. Emma, however, was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her eyes wide with an excitement Sarah hadn't seen in months. "It's like an adventure, Mom, like we're explorers finding a lost castle." Sarah forced a smile. "That's exactly what we are, sweetheart. Explorers." She opened her door and stepped out into air that smelled of sage and dust and something else, something older and more permanent than the troubles that had chased them here. They approached the house carefully, Sarah testing each porch step before putting her full weight on it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, swollen from years of desert heat and occasional rain. She pushed it open with her shoulder, and it scraped across a floor covered in sand and debris. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Adobe walls held the coolness even in the afternoon heat. The main room was larger than Sarah had expected, with exposed wooden beams across the ceiling, some intact, some sagging with rot. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with animal droppings and wind-blown tumbleweeds. The floor was concrete, cracked but solid. Doorways led to what appeared to be bedrooms and a kitchen area. Everything was coated in the fine dust of abandonment. Emma wandered through the rooms with the fearlessness of childhood, narrating her discoveries. "This one can be my room. It has a window that looks at those big red rocks. Mom, there's a bathtub in here, but it's all rusty." Sarah followed more cautiously, her paralegal training kicking in as she mentally cataloged what needed immediate attention. Structural integrity, water source, electrical wiring if any existed, vermin control. The list grew with each room she entered. In what had once been the kitchen, ancient appliances stood like monuments to another era. A calendar on the wall was stuck on September 2003, its pages yellowed and brittle. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, Sarah made a decision. They would camp inside tonight, despite the house's condition. It was their house now, and they needed to claim it. She brought in their sleeping bags and set them up in the main room, away from the damaged section. Emma helped arrange their belongings, treating it like the adventure she'd proclaimed it to be. That night, lying on the hard floor with Emma curled beside her, Sarah stared up at the ceiling beams and listened to the sounds of the desert. Wind moaned through the broken windows. Something small scratched across the roof. In the distance, a coyote called out, its voice lonely and wild. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived the Depression by sheer will and resourcefulness. That same blood ran through her veins. She could do this. She had to. Morning came with startling clarity. The desert sun flooding through the eastern windows with an intensity that made Sarah squint. Emma was already awake, standing in the doorway and looking out at their land. Their land. The words still felt impossible. "Mom, there's a man." Sarah jerked upright, her heart suddenly pounding. Through the doorway, she saw a pickup truck approaching, newer than anything she'd seen on the drive here, kicking up a plume of dust. She stood quickly, positioning herself between Emma and the door, unsure whether to feel relieved at the prospect of help or concerned about who would be visiting this remote property so early. The truck stopped 50 feet from the house, and a man in his 50s climbed out. He was tall and weathered, wearing jeans, work boots, and a canvas jacket despite the morning heat. His face was deeply tanned, lined with the kind of creases that came from decades of outdoor work. He approached slowly, hands visible and empty, the posture of someone who understood rural protocol. "Morning," he called out when he was close enough. "Name's Dale Cooper. Own the spread about 5 miles west of here. Saw lights last night. Figured I'd come check on who finally bought the old Rodriguez place." Sarah stepped onto the porch, keeping Emma behind her. "Sarah Bennett, this is my daughter Emma. We just closed on the property yesterday." Dale nodded, his eyes taking in the state of the house and the two women with the expression that was hard to read. "Long way from anywhere to start over," he observed. It wasn't quite a question. "That's what I'm counting on," Sarah replied. He studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to come to some decision. "Place has been sitting empty a long time. Martin Rodriguez, he was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but he was decent. When he passed, there was some talk in town, some questions that never got answered." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, her paralegal instincts awakening. Dale shifted his weight, glancing at Emma before continuing. "Martin was a cattle rancher for most of his life. Did okay, nothing spectacular. But in his last few years, something changed. He stopped running cattle, stopped taking visitors, stopped coming into town except for supplies. When he died, they found him in his truck out on the north pasture. Heart attack, they said. But the strange thing was, his truck was loaded with camping gear, food, water, like he'd been planning to go somewhere, or hide somewhere." A chill ran down Sarah's spine despite the warming morning air. "Did anyone investigate?" "County sheriff came out, looked around, didn't find anything worth pursuing. Martin was 73, lived alone, no family. Sometimes old ranchers get eccentric. That was the official line." Dale paused. "But I'd see him sometimes, late at night, driving equipment out toward the north section of his property. Heavy equipment. Didn't make sense for a man who wasn't ranching anymore." Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, what's he talking about?" "Nothing, baby, just ranch history." Sarah looked back at Dale. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you seem like someone who ended up here because you didn't have anywhere else to go," Dale said bluntly. "And those are usually the people who stumble into things they shouldn't. If you plan on staying, if you plan on really making this work, you should know what you bought. This land, it's got secrets. Martin made sure of that." Before Sarah could respond, Dale reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Found this tucked into my fence post about a month after Martin died. Figured it was meant for whoever came next." Sarah took the paper. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. North pasture, coordinates 35.8742, 106.3251. The truth is buried. Where no one thought to look, trust no one official. M.R." Her hands trembled as she read it twice. "Have you checked these coordinates?" "Not my land to check," Dale said. "And after Martin died, there were federal vehicles out here for a few days. Men in suits, not saying who they were or what they wanted. They left, everything went quiet, and I decided some mysteries were better left alone." He tipped his hat. "But you own it now. Your choice what you do with it. Just thought you should know what you might be walking into." As Dale drove away, Sarah stood on the porch with the note in her hand and Emma asking questions she couldn't answer. The coordinates burned in her mind. The north pasture, federal vehicles, secrets that had died with a lonely old rancher. She looked out at the vast expanse of land that stretched toward the distant mesas, land that was legally hers now, and made a decision that would change everything. This afternoon, after she got Emma settled with her books and drawings, she would drive to those coordinates. She would see what Martin Rodriguez had been so desperate to hide. What Sarah Bennett would discover in the north pasture, buried beneath 3 feet of desert soil and sealed behind a reinforced steel door, would bring the FBI to her doorstep within 72 hours and force her to confront a truth that had been hidden for 20 years. A truth that would make her $475 purchase the most dangerous bargain she'd ever made. But first, she needed to find it. Sarah waited until afternoon when the sun hung high and merciless over the desert. Emma was settled in what would become her bedroom, drawing pictures of their new home with the optimistic imagination of childhood, transforming broken windows into grand archways and collapsed roofs into towers. Sarah had given her daughter the last granola bars from their dwindling supplies and a promise to return within an hour. The drive north across her own property felt surreal. The Civic bounced over terrain that had never been meant for sedans, scraping bottom on rocks that jutted from the hardpan like broken teeth. She kept the paper with Martin Rodriguez's coordinates on the passenger seat, checking her phone's GPS despite the stuttering signal. The numbers led her away from anything resembling civilization, deeper into the raw emptiness that characterized this corner of New Mexico. The land changed as she drove. What had been relatively flat scrubland near the house gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. Arroyos cut through the earth like old scars, their sandy bottoms testimony to flash floods that could turn these dry channels into raging torrents within minutes. She passed the rusted skeleton of what might have been a windmill once, its blades long since torn away by wind and time. A section of fence still stood in places, though most posts had rotted and fallen, leaving wire coiled in the dirt like dead snakes. When the GPS indicated she was within 100 feet of the coordinates, Sarah stopped the car and got out. The silence hit her first. No bird calls, no insect hum, just the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation and the ticking of her car's cooling engine. She turned slowly, scanning the landscape for anything unusual. The ground here was slightly elevated, a low mesa that offered a view of the surrounding ranch land and, in the far distance, the shimmer of what might be a road. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just more desert, more rocks, more evidence of a land that had outlasted everyone who tried to tame it. Then her eye caught something that didn't belong. About 50 feet ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of juniper trees, the ground looked different. The vegetation was sparser there, and the soil had a quality that didn't match its surroundings, as if it had been disturbed and allowed to settle in a pattern nature wouldn't have chosen. Sarah approached slowly, her heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. As she got closer, she could see what her eye had detected from a distance. The ground had definitely been excavated at some point. A rectangular area, perhaps 10 feet by 12, where the earth had been moved and replaced. Whoever had done it had tried to conceal their work, scattering rocks and encouraging native plants to take root, but years of erosion and settling had revealed the truth beneath. She knelt at the edge of the disturbed area and brushed away surface dirt with her hands. Within minutes, her fingers struck something solid. Not rock. Metal. She worked faster now, clearing away more soil, following the edge of whatever lay beneath. It took nearly 30 minutes of digging with her bare hands before she understood what she had found. A hatch. Heavy steel, sunk flush with the ground, with a wheel lock mechanism like something from a submarine. The metal was weathered but intact, and along one edge, barely visible beneath the oxidation, were numbers stenciled in yellow paint. Construction date 1998, Rodriguez M. Private Property. Sarah sat back on her heels, her hands filthy, her mind racing. Martin Rodriguez had built something underground out here, something substantial enough to require a reinforced hatch and deliberate concealment. The note's words echoed in her memory. The truth is buried where no one thought to look. She grasped the wheel lock and pulled. It didn't budge. She tried again, throwing her full weight into it, and this time felt the mechanism give slightly, metal scraping against metal after years of disuse. On her third attempt, the wheel turned. The sound it made was like the groan of something waking from a long sleep, reluctant and ominous. The hatch released with a hydraulic hiss that made Sarah jump back. Slowly, fighting against its own weight and rust, the steel door lifted a few inches. She got her fingers under the edge and heaved it fully open. A ladder descended into darkness. Cool air rose from below, carrying the smell of concrete and something else, something sterile and out of place in the middle of the desert. Sarah pulled out her phone and activated its flashlight. The weak beam illuminated the first few rungs of the ladder and suggested a depth of at least 15 feet. Every instinct screamed at her to call someone, to not go down there alone. But who would she call? The local sheriff who had dismissed Martin Rodriguez's death as natural? Dale Cooper, who had explicitly said some mysteries were better left alone? The federal agents who had apparently already been here once looking for something? She thought of Emma back at the house, drawing pictures and trusting that her mother would return. She thought of the $475 that represented everything she had left in the world. She thought of the motel room they'd escaped, the truck stop diner grease still under her fingernails, the medical bills that would follow them no matter how far they ran. Sarah began to climb down. The ladder was solid, bolted into concrete walls that became visible as she descended. Her phone's light revealed a shaft that was professionally constructed, not the rough excavation of an amateur. At the bottom, her feet touched a concrete floor. She swept the light around and gasped. She was standing in an underground room, roughly 20 feet square with an 8-foot ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were boxes, filing cabinets, and equipment that looked both dated and expensive. In one corner sat a desk with an old computer monitor and tower, their screens dark, but their presence suggesting this space had been used recently, or at least within the last decade. The air was dry, the temperature controlled by some mechanism she couldn't immediately identify. But it was the walls themselves that made Sarah's breath catch. They were covered in photographs, maps, and documents, all arranged with the obsessive precision of someone constructing a case. And in the center of it all, taking up the largest section of wall space, was a single word written in red marker, underlined 3 times: Clearwater. Sarah moved closer, her phone's light revealing layers of information that seemed to span decades. Photographs of what appeared to be a facility, industrial and sterile, with no identifying markers. Grainy images of trucks with hazmat symbols, maps of New Mexico with areas circled in red, and newspaper clippings, dozens of them, their headlines telling a story that made Sarah's stomach turn. Cancer cluster investigated in Clearwater County. Environmental concerns raised near federal facility. Families seek answers after children's illnesses. She pulled one of the filing cabinets open. Inside were folders labeled by year, starting in 1985 and running through 2002. She pulled out the most recent folder and found medical records, official-looking documents with names redacted, showing diagnoses of various cancers, respiratory diseases, and neurological conditions. Tucked between the pages was a handwritten note in the same shaky script she'd seen on the paper Dale Cooper had given her. They told us it was safe. They told us the testing was contained. They lied. 37 families, 42 children, all within a 10-mile radius. I kept every record they tried to bury. This is my testimony. This is my revenge. M.R. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued searching through the bunker. Another cabinet contained what appeared to be soil and water samples, carefully labeled and dated, sealed in airtight containers. A third held technical documents with government seals, marked confidential and for official use only. Pages and pages of data about groundwater contamination, radiation levels, and exposure assessments. The picture was becoming clear, and it was horrifying. Martin Rodriguez hadn't been a paranoid recluse. He had been a documentarian, a witness to something terrible. Somewhere near this ranch, possibly on what was once federal land, there had been contamination. Deliberate or accidental, she couldn't tell, but the results had been devastating for the people who lived nearby. And Rodriguez had spent the last years of his life collecting evidence, building a case that he apparently never lived to present. She found a box labeled personal and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs of families, smiling faces at birthday parties and school events. Children with Rodriguez, who appeared in several images, his arm around their shoulders, his expression gentle in a way that contradicted the isolation Dale Cooper had described. On the back of one photo, written in a woman's handwriting, "To Martin, thank you for caring when no one else would. The Morrison family." Beneath the photographs was a journal, its pages filled with Rodriguez's increasingly desperate handwriting. Sarah flipped to the last entry, dated 3 days before his death. "They know I have the documents. Black SUV parked at the end of my access road for 2 days now. I've moved everything to the bunker. If something happens to me, if this journal is found, know this. I am not paranoid. I am not crazy. I am a witness. 37 families destroyed, 42 children dead or dying, and the people responsible are still walking free because the truth is too expensive to acknowledge. I pray someone finds this. I pray someone has the courage to finish what I started. God forgive me for not being strong enough to survive long enough to see justice done." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. This old rancher, living alone on land nobody wanted, had carried the weight of an entire community's tragedy. He had documented, preserved, and protected evidence that powerful people wanted buried. And now that evidence belonged to her. A sound from above froze her in place. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving across the ground around the hatch. Her heart hammering, Sarah switched off her phone's light and pressed herself against the wall in the darkness. She heard voices, muffled but authoritative. Vehicle registered to Sarah Bennett. Purchased the property 2 days ago. Looks like she found it. Secure the perimeter. Call it in. Nobody goes down until we have clearance. Sarah's mind raced. Federal agents. They had been monitoring the property, waiting to see if the new owner would discover what Rodriguez had hidden. She was trapped 15 feet underground with evidence that someone clearly didn't want exposed, and the only exit was blocked by people who had the authority to make her disappear as thoroughly as they had apparently made Martin Rodriguez's accusations disappear. She thought of Emma, alone in that broken-down house, waiting for a mother who might not return. The thought galvanized her. She felt along the wall until she found the desk, then carefully felt across its surface until her fingers touched something angular. A flashlight, the old-fashioned kind that took D batteries. She clicked it on, keeping the beam low, and pointed away from the hatch opening. The stronger light revealed something she had missed before. In the far corner of the bunker, partially hidden behind the filing cabinets, was another door. A smaller one, barely 4 feet high, made of the same reinforced steel as the hatch above. She moved quickly, quietly, praying it wasn't locked. The handle turned. Beyond was a tunnel, just tall enough to crouch in, heading north. Martin Rodriguez had built himself an escape route. Sarah grabbed the journal, stuffed it into her jacket, and entered the tunnel, pulling the door shut behind her. She moved as fast as she could while hunched over, the flashlight beam bouncing off rough-hewn walls that suggested Rodriguez had done at least some of this excavation himself. The tunnel stretched for what felt like 100 yards, sloping gradually upward. Her back screamed in protest at the crouch, her lungs burning in the close air. Then, ahead, she saw it. Another ladder leading up to another hatch. She climbed frantically, pushed against the steel door above, and emerged into blinding sunlight. She was in an arroyo, hidden from view of the main bunker location by the terrain. Her car was a quarter-mile away across open ground. She could see figures moving near the hatch, at least 4 people in dark clothing. One was speaking into a radio. They hadn't seen her yet. Sarah ran, not toward her car, but parallel to the arroyo, using its depth for cover. When she was far enough away, she cut across the open ground at an angle that would bring her to her car from the opposite direction. Her lungs burned, her legs shook, but she didn't stop. She could hear shouting now, the agents realizing she had escaped through the tunnel. She reached the Civic, threw herself inside, and gunned the engine. The car protested, tires spinning. In the soft dirt before finding purchase, she drove recklessly, bouncing over rocks and sagebrush, heading not toward the house, but east, toward the road that marked her property boundary. In her rearview mirror, she saw vehicles moving, pursuit beginning. But she had one advantage they didn't. She knew where Emma was, and they didn't, not yet. The drive back to the house took 20 minutes of controlled panic, taking back roads and approaches she'd mapped mentally during her exploration of the property. When she finally skidded to a stop near the porch, Emma came running out, her face bright with excitement that immediately shifted to concern when she saw her mother's condition. "Mom, you're all dirty. What happened?" "We have to pack. Right now, everything we brought. Back in the car. We have to go." "But you said this was our home now. You promised I'd have my own room." Sarah knelt down, gripping her daughter's shoulders, looking into those trusting eyes. "Sometimes promises change, baby. Sometimes we have to be brave and flexible. Can you be brave for me?" Emma's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. They worked together, throwing their meager possessions back into bags with frantic speed. Sarah's mind calculated constantly. The agents knew her name, knew her car, probably knew about Emma. Running would only delay the inevitable. But she needed time. Time to think, time to figure out what to do with the journal burning like a coal in her jacket pocket. She was carrying the last bag to the car when she saw the dust plume on the access road. 3 vehicles, moving fast. They would be here in minutes. Sarah made a decision born of desperation and a paralegal's understanding of the law. She pulled out her phone, opened her email, and began taking photographs of every page of Martin Rodriguez's journal. The camera clicked rapidly as she documented evidence of government wrongdoing, of covered-up contamination, of children who had died while officials looked away. She worked with shaking hands, Emma watching with wide, confused eyes. When the last page was photographed, Sarah addressed an email to every news organization she could think of, every environmental group, every civil rights lawyer whose contact information she could find through her weak cell signal. In the subject line, she wrote, Evidence of federal cover-up in Clearwater County contamination deaths. If anything happens to me or my daughter Emma Bennett, this information must be released. She attached the photos, added the GPS coordinates of the bunker, and typed a final line. I am Sarah Bennett. I purchased the Rodriguez Ranch 2 days ago. I found this evidence. I am not suicidal. I love my daughter. We want to live. This is my insurance policy. Her finger hovered over the send button as the vehicles pulled up to the house, doors opening, agents stepping out with the kind of purposeful calm that was more terrifying than aggression. Sarah pressed send. The email transmitted just as a man in a dark suit approached, his credentials already in hand. Mrs. Bennett, I'm Special Agent Marcus Webb with the FBI. We need to talk about what you found on your property today. Sarah stood up slowly, keeping Emma behind her. We can talk. But first, you should know that I just sent detailed photographs of everything in that bunker to about 50 different people and organizations. If my daughter and I don't check in with specific contacts every 12 hours, those files get released to the public. So before we talk about anything else, Agent Webb, I need you to understand one thing. She met his eyes without flinching, channeling every ounce of strength she had left. Martin Rodriguez died protecting the truth about what happened in Clearwater County. I'm not going to die for it, and neither is my daughter. So whatever happens next, however this conversation goes, you need to know that the evidence is out there now. You can't put this secret back in the ground. Webb's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. Respect, maybe, or calculation, or simply the recognition that the situation had become far more complicated than a simple retrieval operation. Why don't you tell me exactly what you think you found, Mrs. Bennett, and then we'll talk about what happens next. As Emma pressed against her side and the desert wind carried dust across the land that had cost her everything, Sarah began to speak. She told them about the bunker, the documents, the families. She told them about Martin Rodriguez's journal and his dying wish for justice. And with every word, she understood that her $475 purchase hadn't bought her an escape from her old life. It had bought her a war. Agent Webb listened without interruption for 23 minutes. Sarah told him everything, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Emma sat on the porch steps, drawing in the dust with a stick, pretending not to listen while absorbing every word. The other agents remained at a distance, speaking quietly into radios, their postures suggesting they were waiting for instructions from somewhere far above Webb's authority. When Sarah finished, Webb was silent for a long moment. He looked out across the desert landscape, his expression unreadable behind government-issue sunglasses. Finally, he removed those glasses and met her eyes. What she saw there surprised her. Not the cold bureaucratic indifference she had expected, but something more complicated. Weariness, perhaps, or the burden of knowledge held too long. Mrs. Bennett, I'm going to tell you something that could cost me my career, he said quietly. Martin Rodriguez contacted the FBI in 1999. He had evidence then, too, less than what you found, but enough. The case was assigned to me. Sarah's breath caught. What happened? What always happens when national security interests conflict with public safety concerns. The facility Rodriguez was documenting. It was part of a Cold War-era program, weapons testing, experimental materials. By the time we understood the scope of the contamination, shutting it down and acknowledging liability would have cost billions, would have exposed government negligence that had already killed people. Webb's jaw tightened. I was ordered to close the investigation. Rodriguez was deemed an unreliable witness. His evidence was classified and buried. I was told to move on. But you didn't. Sarah understood suddenly. You've been monitoring this property. I've been waiting, Webb corrected. Rodriguez told me before I had to walk away that he'd made copies, that he'd hidden everything where someone would eventually find it. Someone who didn't have anything to lose by telling the truth. He looked at Emma, then back at Sarah. I thought it might be decades before anyone bought this place. But here you are. 2 days in, and you've already found what took me 6 months to locate. One of the other agents approached, holding out a phone. Sir, Washington wants a situation update. Webb waved him off. Tell them we're still assessing. Give me 30 minutes. As the agent retreated, Webb turned back to Sarah. You've put yourself in an impossible position. That email you sent, It's smart insurance, but it also makes you a permanent liability. There are people in various agencies who would prefer Rodriguez's evidence stayed hidden. Not because they're evil, but because acknowledging what happened opens legal exposure that could bankrupt programs they believe keep the country safe. I don't care about their programs, Sarah said, her voice harder than she intended. 42 children died. Their families deserve the truth. I agree with you. Webb pulled out his own phone, scrolling through something, which is why I'm about to do something that will probably end my career. 3 years ago, there was a policy change. Certain classified materials older than 25 years can be declassified if they don't pose current security risks. The Clearwater facility was decommissioned in 2005. It's been cleaned up, allegedly. The contamination Rodriguez documented is historical record now. He looked at her meaningfully. If someone with legal standing, say a property owner who discovered historical documents on their land, were to file a Freedom of Information Act request for materials related to environmental testing in Clearwater County between 1980 and 2003, those documents would have to be reviewed for declassification. And if that same property owner had already released evidence that made the government's hand visible, denying that request would create exactly the kind of public controversy that Washington tries to avoid. Sarah's paralegal training kicked in, following his logic. You're saying I should formalize this. Make it official. I'm saying you should lawyer up, file the proper requests, and force this into the light the legal way. You've already got the public's attention with that email. Now use it to demand transparency through proper channels. Make them declassify what Rodriguez found. Let the family sue for damages. Let the truth come out in court, not in some black ops cleanup operation. And if they refuse? Webb smiled, but there was no humor in it. Then you release everything Rodriguez collected, and you let the public decide if their government's credibility is worth protecting people who covered up children's deaths. You've already backed them into a corner, Mrs. Bennett. Now, you need to give them a way out that doesn't involve making you disappear. Emma appeared at Sarah's side, slipping her small hand into her mother's. Are we in trouble? Webb knelt down to Emma's level, his expression softening. No, sweetheart. Your mom is actually a hero. She found something very important that's going to help a lot of families get answers they've been waiting for. He stood, addressing Sarah again. I'll make some calls. Buy you time. But you need to leave this property tonight. Don't tell me where you're going. Stay off grid for a few days until I can get some protection in place. Protection from who? Sarah asked. I thought you said we should do this legally. Legal doesn't mean safe, not until this story is public enough that silencing you would be worse than letting you talk. Give it 72 hours. Let the media pick up your email. Let the story get oxygen. Then come back and we'll do this right. He handed her a card with a handwritten number on the back. This is my personal cell, not my work phone. Call me in 3 days. We'll coordinate next steps. As Webb walked back to his vehicle, Sarah stood in the dust of her new property, watching the FBI agents depart. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Everything she had thought she was buying, the simple escape, the fresh start, had turned into something far more complex and dangerous. Emma tugged her hand. Mom, do we have to leave? I was starting to like it here. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at the ranch house with its broken windows and sagging roof. This place had been Martin Rodriguez's fortress and his prison. He had lived here alone for years, carrying the weight of truth that no one wanted to hear, dying before he could see justice done. Now that burden had passed to her. Not because she had sought it, but because she had been desperate enough to buy land that nobody else wanted. Yeah, baby, she said softly. We have to leave for a little while, but we'll come back. This is still ours. They packed the car again, this time more carefully, taking only what they needed for a few days. Sarah added the printouts she had made of the bunker's contents to their possessions, along with Rodriguez's journal, wrapped carefully in her grandmother's quilt. As they prepared to drive away, she took one last look at the property in the fading light. The land stretched out in all directions, vast and indifferent to human drama. It had been here long before Rodriguez, before the contamination, before the government programs and cover-ups. It would be here long after all of them were gone. But for now, for this moment in time, It held secrets that mattered. It held truth that demanded to be spoken. Sarah drove them to Albuquerque, to a cheap motel on the outskirts where she paid cash and registered under a false name. For 3 days, she and Emma lived in that cramped room, watching the news on a television that picked up only local channels, monitoring social media on her phone's limited data plan. And slowly, like a seed pushing through hard earth, the story began to grow. The first article appeared in a small New Mexico environmental blog. New ranch owner discovers evidence of federal cover-up. It was brief, mostly speculation, but it referenced her email. Within hours, larger outlets picked it up. By the second day, a national news organization had sent reporters to the coordinates she had provided. They found the bunker, already resealed by the FBI, but visible enough to confirm the story's basics. By the third day, it was national news. Decades-old contamination cover-up exposed in New Mexico. Families who had lost children in Clearwater County were being interviewed. Environmental lawyers were offering services. And somewhere in Washington, people Sarah would never meet were having very uncomfortable conversations about liability and public relations. She called Webb on the morning of the 4th day. He answered on the first ring. "You've created quite a firestorm, Mrs. Bennett. Is it safe for us to come back?" Safe is a relative term, but yes, you're more valuable alive and talking now than silent. The Justice Department has opened an investigation. EPA is reviewing historical data, and several senators are demanding hearings. He paused. "You should also know that someone leaked the full contents of Rodriguez's files to the press last night. Everything from the bunker. It wasn't you, was it?" "No," Sarah said truthfully. "I only sent photographs of the journal." Then someone else had access to that bunker. Someone who decided this was the right moment to make sure everything came out. Webb's tone suggested he had his own theories about who that someone might be. "Regardless, the cat's fully out of the bag now. Come back to the ranch whenever you're ready. I've arranged for state police to do regular patrols of your property. And Mrs. Bennett, get a good lawyer. Several families from Clearwater County want to meet you. They want to thank the person who finally gave them proof of what they'd always known." Sarah and Emma returned to the ranch on a morning when clouds gathered over the mesas, promising the kind of rain that only comes to the desert a few times a year. The property looked exactly as they'd left it, except for one addition. Someone had placed a wreath on the porch, a simple arrangement of wildflowers with a card that read, "For Martin Rodriguez, who never stopped fighting, and for Sarah Bennett, who finished the fight." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. A pro bono legal team took her case, filing lawsuits against multiple government agencies on behalf of the Clearwater families. The media attention brought donations, enough to begin real repairs on the ranch house. But more than that, it brought people. Dale Cooper was the first to return, driving up with a truck full of building supplies and a quiet apology. "I should have checked those coordinates years ago. Should have had the courage Rodriguez had. I'm sorry." Abigail Morrison arrived next, a woman in her 50s with her mother's eyes in the photograph Sarah had found in the bunker. "My younger brother died when I was 12. Leukemia, they said. Just bad luck. But Mom always knew it was more than that." She wrote to everyone, trying to get someone to investigate. Martin was the only one who listened. She pressed her hand to the porch railing, her voice thick. "Thank you for finishing what he started, for giving us a name for what killed Tommy." More families came, sharing stories of children lost, of illnesses that had devastated a community while officials insisted there was no pattern, no cause for concern, nothing to investigate. They brought photographs, medical records, their own documentation that corroborated everything Rodriguez had preserved. Standing in front of the ranch house that had become an unexpected monument to their grief, they formed a collective voice that could no longer be ignored. The legal process was slow, grinding through depositions and document reviews and bureaucratic resistance, but it moved forward. The EPA confirmed elevated radiation levels in soil samples from the Clearwater area. The Department of Energy admitted to historical operational irregularities at the testing facility. More important than the careful bureaucratic language, families began receiving settlements. Not enough to bring back the dead, but enough to acknowledge that their losses had been real, that their suffering mattered, that someone had been at fault. Sarah used part of her own settlement to complete the ranch house restoration. She replaced the roof, repaired the adobe walls, installed proper plumbing and electricity. Emma's bedroom became real, with windows that actually closed and walls painted a soft yellow that caught the morning light. The main room was furnished simply but comfortably, and on one wall, Sarah hung the photograph she had found in the bunker. Martin Rodriguez, with his arm around the Morrison children, smiling in a way that showed the man he had been before sorrow and purpose had consumed him. She didn't farm the land. Instead, she converted the property into something Rodriguez would have appreciated: a research station and archive. Environmental scientists used it as a base for studying long-term contamination effects. The bunker itself became a carefully preserved historical site, a place where students and journalists could see the evidence of both government wrongdoing and one man's determination to expose it. Sarah hired staff to manage the programs, creating jobs in a community that had lost so much. Abigail Morrison became a regular visitor, helping to catalog Rodriguez's documents and sharing her own family's story with researchers. Dale Cooper donated a section of his property to expand the research station, his guilt transformed into action. Even Agent Webb appeared occasionally, officially retired now, speaking to groups about the importance of whistleblowers and the cost of choosing conscience over career. On a September evening, exactly 1 year after Sarah had spent her last $475 at a county auction, she stood on her porch and watched storm clouds build over the northern mesas. Emma was inside, doing homework at a proper desk in her own room, her earlier transient life now feeling like someone else's story. The rain, when it came, would be heavy. The desert would drink it down greedily, and for a few days the land would transform, blooming with wildflowers that only appeared when water touched them awake. Sarah thought about Martin Rodriguez, dying alone in his truck, his mission incomplete. She thought about the families who had waited decades for acknowledgement of their pain. She thought about her own desperate gamble, buying abandoned land because she had nowhere else to go, and discovering that sometimes the places nobody wants are the places where the most important stories hide. The first drops of rain hit the dusty ground, each one leaving a small dark mark. She thought about Emma, who had gained not just a home but a legacy of courage. Her daughter would grow up knowing that her mother had stood against people more powerful than herself, and won. Not easily, not cleanly, but decisively. That was worth more than any inheritance of money or property. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain across miles of open land. Sarah closed her eyes and let it wash over her. This ranch, which had cost her almost nothing and nearly everything, had taught her something essential about the relationship between land and truth. The earth keeps secrets, but it also gives them up to those willing to dig. It remembers what humans try to forget, and it passes those memories to whoever is brave enough or desperate enough to claim them. Lightning flickered over the mesas, and thunder followed seconds later. Emma appeared in the doorway behind her. "Mom, it's raining." "I know, baby. Isn't it beautiful?" They stood together on the porch, watching water fall on land that had been parched for months. The desert accepted the rain without question, without judgment, simply grateful for what came when it came. Sarah understood that feeling now, the gratitude of survival, the quiet triumph of standing in a place you built from ruins and knowing it will shelter you through whatever storms come next. The ranch had secrets still, she was certain of that. 60 acres held more stories than one person could uncover in a lifetime. But the most important secret, the truth that Martin Rodriguez had died protecting, was out in the world now, spoken, acknowledged, made real in courtrooms and congressional hearings and the slow turning of justice's wheels. As darkness fell and rain drummed steady on the new roof, Sarah went inside and closed the door. Outside, the land drank and remembered. Inside, a mother and daughter sat down to dinner in a house that had been built by ghosts and reclaimed by the living. The abandoned ranch had found its purpose, and the woman who bought it for less than the price of a used car had discovered that sometimes the best investments are the ones you make when you have nothing left to lose. The rain continued through the night, washing the desert clean, filling the arroyos with rushing water that would be gone by morning but would leave its mark in the earth. Some things, Sarah had learned, endure not because they're permanent but because they're true. And truth, like water in the desert, always finds a way to reach the surface, even when it has to wait 20 years to do it. 5 years passed like seasons turning, each one leaving its mark on the land and the people who worked it. The ranch that Sarah Bennett had purchased for $475 had become something Martin Rodriguez could never have imagined but would have understood completely. The Rodriguez Memorial Research Station now employed 12 full-time staff and hosted visiting scientists from universities across the country. The bunker where Rodriguez had hidden his evidence was now a climate-controlled archive, its walls still bearing his handwritten notes, preserved behind protective glass like artifacts in a museum of conscience. Emma turned 13 that spring, and Sarah watched her daughter help catalog new soil samples with the ease of someone who had grown up understanding that truth required patience and precision. The girl who had once drawn pictures of broken windows transformed into towers now understood that some structures needed to be torn down completely before they could be rebuilt properly. She knew the names of every family who had lost someone to the Clearwater contamination. She understood, in the way only children raised on hard truth can, that her mother's accidental purchase had been part of something larger than luck or desperation. The settlement money had continued to arrive over the years, distributed to families through a legal process that moved with glacial determination. The government never admitted criminal wrongdoing, instead using carefully crafted language about historical operational practices that did not meet current safety standards. But the families didn't need admissions. They needed acknowledgement, and they needed compensation for medical bills that had bankrupted them, for futures stolen from children who never reached adulthood, for decades of being told their grief was paranoia. Abigail Morrison had become the station's director of community outreach. Her own family's tragedy transformed into expertise that helped other affected families navigate the legal and emotional complexity of late justice. She had Martinez Rodriguez's photograph enlarged and hung in the station's main building, and beneath it, she placed a plaque with his words from the journal, "I am a witness." On the anniversary of Sarah's discovery, the station held an annual gathering. Families came from across New Mexico and beyond, bringing photographs of the children they had lost, sharing stories that needed to be spoken aloud in a place that honored rather than dismissed them. They walked the land together, often in silence, as if the desert itself could absorb some of their long-carried sorrow. Some planted trees in memory of their loved ones. Others simply stood and looked out across the mesas, finding peace in the knowledge that this place existed, that someone had cared enough to preserve the evidence, that their truth was now part of the historical record. Dale Cooper had become an unlikely activist in his retirement, speaking at environmental conferences about the dangers of government secrecy and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. He and Sarah had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He taught Emma how to read the land, how to understand which plants indicated underground water, which rocks held stories of ancient oceans, which animal tracks meant drought or abundance. The girl absorbed it all with the seriousness of someone who understood that knowledge was both inheritance and responsibility. Agent Marcus Webb appeared occasionally, always unannounced, always staying just long enough to update Sarah on bureaucratic developments she probably didn't need to know, but that he seemed compelled to share. He had aged visibly since their first encounter, the weight of decades spent enforcing laws he sometimes disagreed with now released into something like relief. He told her once, standing on the porch as evening fell, that helping her had been the first thing he'd felt genuinely proud of in 20 years of service. "You gave me permission to be honest," he said quietly. "That's rarer than you'd think in my line of work." The ranch house itself had evolved into something both functional and beautiful. Sarah had kept elements of its original structure, the thick adobe walls and exposed ceiling beams, honoring the bones Rodriguez had maintained, even as his world narrowed to obsession and isolation. But she had added light, installed large windows that brought the desert inside, created spaces that felt open rather than defensive. It was a home again, not a fortress. Emma's room overlooked the northern Bahia pasture, and on clear nights, she could see the distant glow of Albuquerque against the horizon. Sarah sometimes found her daughter at the window, looking out across land that had witnessed so much suffering and survival, and wondered what the girl was thinking. Emma rarely spoke about the fear of those first days, the FBI agents and the desperate drive to the motel, but Sarah knew those memories shaped her in ways that would only become clear as she grew older. One evening in late summer, as thunderheads built over the mountains and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain, Sarah sat on the porch with a letter she had received that morning. It was from Robert Morrison, Abigail's older brother, who had been 18 when his younger sibling Tommy died. He had spent 30 years carrying survivor's guilt and anger at a system that had failed his family. The letter was brief but devastating in its simplicity. I spent most of my life thinking Tommy's death was meaningless, random bad luck that destroyed my family for no reason. Learning the truth didn't bring him back, but it gave his death context. It gave my parents' grief validation. It let me finally understand that we weren't crazy or cursed. We were victims of decisions made by people who valued secrecy over lives. Thank you for making sure the world knows what happened. Thank you for proving that one person's courage can matter. Tommy's name is in the historical record now, attached to documented evidence of negligence. That's more than we ever thought we'd have. It's enough. Sarah folded the letter carefully and watched the storm approach. This was what the ranch had become. Not just a research station or an archive, but a place where people could lay down burdens they had carried too long. A place where grief could be witnessed and honored without being questioned or dismissed. Rodriguez had created it through his solitary documentation, and she had opened it to the world, but it belonged to all of them now. Every family who had lost someone, every person who had demanded truth when silence was easier, every researcher who came here to understand how contamination moved through soil and water and ultimately into human bodies. The rain began as darkness fell, gentle at first, then building to the kind of downpour that made the desert bloom. Sarah stood and went inside, closing the door against the weather but leaving the window open so she could smell the petrichor, that ancient scent of rain on dry earth. Emma was at the kitchen table, working on a school project about environmental justice. She had chosen to write about the Clearwater contamination, interviewing families who came to the station, reviewing documents in the archive, approaching the subject with the scholarly distance of someone who knew the story intimately but was determined to tell it fairly. "Mom," Emma said without looking up from her laptop, "did you ever regret finding the bunker? Like, if you could go back to that first day and just not dig in the coordinates, would you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. If she hadn't found Rodriguez's evidence, they would have lived in the ranch house undisturbed. No FBI, no media attention, no transformation of their lives into something public and complicated. But 42 children would have remained unnamed victims of undocumented contamination. Families would have continued believing they were paranoid or unlucky. Rodriguez's years of work would have rotted in an underground room, his sacrifice meaningless. "No," Sarah said finally, "I wouldn't change it. Some discoveries choose you, Emma. You don't get to decide what you find. You only get to decide what you do with it once you know." Emma nodded, her fingers resuming their typing. She understood. She had grown up in the aftermath of that choice, watching her mother testify at hearings, seeing families cry with relief at finally being believed, learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Years continued to pass. The research station expanded, adding a second building to house visiting fellows and a greenhouse where botanists studied desert plants' ability to absorb and neutralize contaminants. The work attracted grants from environmental organizations and universities, creating a sustainable operation that would outlast Sarah's lifetime. She had established a board of directors that included Abigail Morrison, Dale Cooper, and 3 members of Clearwater families, ensuring the station would remain true to its mission even after she was gone. Emma went to college, studying environmental law, her mother's accidental heroism transformed into deliberate career preparation. She came home during summers and worked at the station, interviewing elderly community members about their memories of the contamination, building an oral history that complemented Rodriguez's documentary evidence. She understood, perhaps better than Sarah, that their ranch wasn't just property. It was proof that ordinary people could stand against institutional power and win. Not easily, not completely, but meaningfully. On Emma's 20th birthday, Sarah gave her daughter something she had kept private for years. Rodriguez's journal, the original, its pages brittle and yellowed but still legible. "He wrote this for someone who would care enough to finish what he started," Sarah said. "That was me, but it's you now. You're the next generation of witnesses." Emma held the journal carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Did he know? When he was hiding all this, did he know someone would find it? "I think he had faith," Sarah replied. "Not certainty, but faith. That's harder to maintain and maybe more valuable." The ranch continued its quiet work, bearing witness to the past while supporting research into the future. Scientists published papers based on data collected from the property, advancing understanding of long-term contamination effects and remediation strategies. Students came for internships and left with broadened perspectives on environmental justice. Families continued their annual pilgrimage, finding solace in a place that refused to forget. Sarah turned 45 in the house she had purchased at 34, and the difference felt like multiple lifetimes. She had gray in her hair now, lines around her eyes that came from squinting against desert sun and from worry that had carved itself permanently into her face during those first dangerous months. But she had also found something she hadn't known she was seeking. Purpose that extended beyond survival, community built on shared values rather than convenient proximity, and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing she had done something that mattered. Dale Cooper died peacefully in his sleep at 82, and Sarah spoke at his funeral, telling stories about a man who had lived with regret and transformed it into action. Agent Webb sent flowers with a note that simply said, "He made the right choice in the end." The local paper ran an obituary that mentioned his environmental activism, but said nothing about his earlier silence regarding the Clearwater contamination. Some truths, Sarah had learned, were too complex for headlines. The land itself seemed to heal in ways that were more emotional than empirical. The contamination levels remained elevated in certain areas, probably would for another generation, but the desert had reclaimed the site of the old testing facility. Juniper and sage grew over concrete foundations. Wind-blown sand covered tire tracks and boot prints. Nature was patient. It would outlast all of them, absorbing their dramas into geology, turning their urgent struggles into sediment that future archaeologists might someday puzzle over. On a morning 20 years after Sarah had spent her last $475 at a county auction, she stood on the porch and watched sunrise paint the mesas gold and crimson. Emma, now 31 and running a nonprofit focused on environmental justice litigation, was visiting with her own daughter, a bright-eyed 6-year-old named Rosa who had never known anything but a world where her grandmother was quietly famous for doing the right thing at considerable personal cost. Rosa was exploring the property with the fearless curiosity of childhood, examining rocks and lizards with equal fascination. Sarah watched her granddaughter and thought about legacy, about what gets passed down through blood and story. Rosa would grow up knowing that her family's land was built on truth-telling. She would understand that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the example of someone who refused to look away from hard truths. "She reminds me of you at that age," Sarah said to Emma, who stood beside her holding a coffee mug. "Brave, without knowing she's being brave." "I knew," Emma said quietly. "I was terrified most of the time, but you didn't look scared, so I figured we must be okay." Sarah laughed softly. "I was terrified too. I just didn't want you to know." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Rosa discover the world. In the distance, staff members were arriving at the research station, beginning another day of cataloging, analyzing, and remembering. Somewhere in the archive, Martin Rodriguez's photograph looked out over the work that bore his name. Somewhere in legal databases, court documents recorded the government's acknowledgement of wrongdoing and compensation paid to families. Somewhere in congressional records, testimony detailed how one woman's desperate purchase had exposed decades of institutional failure. But here, on this porch, it was simply morning. The desert was alive with birdsong. The air smelled of sage and possibility. And 3 generations of women stood on land that had been bought for almost nothing and had yielded something priceless. Proof that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find someone willing to dig it up. Sarah thought about the county clerk who had warned her about isolation and difficulty, about Dale Cooper's cryptic note, and Edward Thompson's concern. About Agent Webb's weary complicity transformed into active assistance. About all the people who had been part of this story, some willingly and some through accident of geography or conscience. They had formed a constellation around a secret that demanded revelation, and together they had brought light to something powerful. People wanted to keep dark. The ranch would continue. The research would expand. Rosa and children like her would grow up in a world slightly more honest because one old rancher had documented the truth and one desperate woman had been brave enough to expose it. That was the real legacy of the Rodriguez Ranch. Not the buildings or the grants or the media attention, but the demonstration that ordinary people, armed with nothing but evidence and determination, could demand accountability from institutions designed to avoid it. As the sun climbed higher and Rosa's laughter echoed across land that remembered everything, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in those first desperate days, certainty that she had made the right choice, not just in buying this property, but in every decision that followed, in refusing to walk away, in sending that email, in standing on this porch facing federal agents while her daughter hid behind her, in transforming trauma into testimony and grief into purpose. The desert wind carried the scent of rain from distant storms, promising water that might arrive today or tomorrow or never, but always promising. The land was patient. It held its secrets until someone was ready to receive them. It witnessed suffering and survival with equal indifference, recording both in layers of soil and stone. And when the time was right, when desperation or courage or simple chance brought the right person to the right place, it gave up what it had been holding. Sarah Bennett had been that person, not because she was particularly brave or qualified, but because she had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The abandoned ranch had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it, and together they had become something neither could have been alone, a testament to the power of truth and the long memory of land that refuses to forget. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.